No worries, this is not a sermon on stewardship. Although it could very easily be a reflection on stewarding your entire life to God. In just 2 weeks, the international community will commemorate the 4th anniversary of the death of Nelson Mandela, a luminary that history can barely contain due to his excessive and truly unbelievable commitment to equality and justice rooted in his faith in Jesus. Born into royalty, as many of our saints were, Mandela chose a path of undoing systemic evils. He became a lawyer and joined the African National Congress, criticizing the colonial legacy of his country, South Africa. After the National Party's white-only government established apartheid as the law of the land, Mandela committed himself to its unraveling. And in 1962, he was arrested for conspiring to overthrow the state and sentenced to life in prison. Now, apartheid means separateness, or the state of being apart, literally aparthood. And this codified system of racial stratification began to take form in South Africa under the Dutch Empire during the colonization of the slave population. Apartheid was a blatant refusal to accept what we now understand as humanity's fundamental interconnectedness. Mandela would be offered conditional releases from imprisonment 7 times, but each offer had too many strings attached, requiring him to retire in silence and exile, and to abandon his dream for the end of segregation. Going back into a society that denied his very existence would have simply fed the machine that rejected him in the first place. Somehow, he found within himself a reservoir deep enough, with grace powerful enough, to reject these offers for partial freedom in order to hold hope for full-on Christian redemption. Here are a few lines from his statement he wrote from prison that his daughter read aloud to the government. I cherish my own freedom dearly, but I care even more for your freedom. Too many have died since I went to prison. Too many have suffered for the love of freedom. I owe it to their widows, to their orphans, to their mothers and fathers, who have grieved and wept for them. Not only I have suffered during these long, lonely, wasted years, but I cannot sell my birthright, nor am I prepared to sell the birthright of the people to be free. And just like that, with untold courage and integrity, Mandela handed the government's disingenuous final offer for release back to them. In other words, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow. And this injustice stops with me. In today's gospel, we encounter the parable of Jesus that was actually read at Nelson Mandela's funeral. No doubt due to the deep resonance between this biblical passage and his extraordinary life. In it, Jesus shares about a certain master who has entrusted a huge amount of money in the hands of 3 slaves in order for them to conduct business on his behalf while he's away. He gives 5 talents to the first slave, 2 to the second, and 1 to the third. The first 2 slaves engage in trading, bargaining, and most likely risky investment efforts, but both, however, double what they had been given. But then we have the third slave. And I have to say, contrary to popular opinion, I've always loved this slave. I'm drawn to him. His actions interest me. The third slave goes off and digs a hole and buries his master's money in the ground. When the master returns to settle accounts with him, he discovers that the first 2 slaves have double the original amount and replies, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. When the master approaches the third slave, however, we have a drastically different scenario. But let me pause here and come back to the rest of the parable in a bit in order to break open this first part. As we've discovered in the Gospel according to Matthew over these past few months together, parables are challenging because they're supposed to be. They take us out of our minds and into the terrain of our hearts where God allows us to see more holistically. But I have to say, this parable is a really tough read. And I don't mean that it's hard to stomach. I mean that it has lent itself to popular readings of which I'm somewhat suspect. One popular interpretation is that the rich landowner, this master, prone to angry outbursts, is God. Think about that. Why is it our tendency to identify the person with the most earthly power as God? And what does that say about us? In this interpretation, the first and second slave essentially received first and second prize for increasing their master's wealth. They were good hedge fund managers and quantitative investors, if you will, securing the best return on investment. While the third slave is banished for returning in full what he had been given. Our modern minds can somewhat understand this interpretation. Return on investment rules the world, after all. I don't know about you, though, but I don't see God as the Wolf of Wall Street anywhere in Holy Scriptures. And this image of God is certainly nowhere in Matthew's Gospel, whose themes are the overabundance of God to all, in his reign in the kingdom of heaven on earth. Nor do these interpretations resonate with Jesus, who says in this very gospel, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." There's also another rather simplistic interpretation of this parable that says talent is just referring to what the church today calls the 3 T's. You all know them: time, treasure, talent. But understanding talent just as human ability isn't the original meaning of the word in the scripture. Talent here actually refers to money. For instance, 1 talent alone would have equaled the average wages of one person for around 15 years. The monetary equivalent today of about $500,000. So knowing this fact makes me wonder if something more subversive is going on in this parable just below the surface. Which leads me back to the third slave. Now, when the master approaches him, this shrewd slave speaks first and says, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours." Well, as we read, the master rages and eviscerates him, calls him names, says he's worthless. But not before a truly stunning admission. It's subtle, but it's absolutely there. As the plot thickens around the boldness of the third slave to speak out in such a way, the master responds with these telling words. "You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest." It was not uncommon Jewish practice to bury talents in the ground to protect them from thieves. So in this moment of the parable, imagine the evocative gesture of the slave digging the talent back up and returning it to his master, as if to say, "Here's what you reaped, but did not sow. I refuse to play this game any longer. It is the ultimate slap in the face. This slave outing his master as corrupt and without integrity is a profound moment of civil disobedience. But then, just as Nelson Mandela was thrown into prison for 27 years for similar audacity, this slave is thrown into outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. It seems to follow, then, that standing up to a corrupt system, exposing it for what it truly is, grants us alienation and isolation in this world. But the parable doesn't end there. At least the 1990s South African version of this parable doesn't. The evil of apartheid actually sparked some of the most influential global social movements of the 20th century. One of the best known being the Ubuntu theology of the Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Just as apartheid means the state of being apart, Ubuntu means the state of being inextricably together. It's a theology taken straight from Matthew's gospel, to love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, the theological idea of Ubuntu can be extracted directly from the heart of Mosaic law and Jewish hospitality. As a political prisoner, Mandela continued to grow the country's anti-apartheid movement, showing that speaking truth to power, even from a prison cell, can be the mustard seed that changes the world. Amid growing domestic and international pressure, Mandela was finally released in 1990, and in collaboration with the white head of state, they negotiated together an end to apartheid, eventually voting Nelson Mandela to be South Africa's first ever democratically elected president. He was 76 years old. This is how God works. And I think this is what Jesus may be teaching us in today's gospel. That God can take historical atrocities and systems of oppression and birth from them unimaginable movements of freedom. There is power in selflessness. And there is power in trusting the slow, incremental work of God. When selflessness confronts selfishness, greed and fear become undone. When one person risks their life on behalf of others to expose a system that rewards itself by punishing those who threaten its power, that system, like the master in our parable, gets angry and begins to unravel. Jesus occupies this space of unraveling, and he invites us over and over again to join him there. The third slave, just like Nelson Mandela, had the courage to stand up to power at immense expense to himself and his livelihood, and in so doing, modeled what the long road to freedom might look like. Sound familiar? As we know from the life of our Lord, incarnational living isn't easy, and it will cost us everything. I believe we're called to bury our lives in the ground of God in order to see what might grow. And I believe toiling that ground is our life's work, uncovering uncommon courage, reverberations of which live on much longer than we do. As we attempt our best efforts to mirror the life of Christ in our daily lives, may God grant us the bold grace to never sell out, the grace to forego selfishness for selflessness, the grace to remember that our world is too interconnected for anything but equality, and too in need for anything but love. Perhaps when we abandon apartheid for Ubuntu, that is, division for unity, we will be more fully absorbed into the presence of God. And maybe, just maybe, we will be summoned into our full existence with these ancient words made anew. Enter into the joy of your master, for reaping what you sowed, and for harvesting all the seeds you spent your life planting in the garden of God. Amen.
Amen.